Good evening and welcome to episode 60. Episode 60 of the political 61. Episode 61 of the political mic. It is my privilege and honor to introduce yet another distinguished batch of panelists for you tonight. We're going to be diving into some really heavy topics. We're talking about the confirmation now of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. We're going to be diving into the Senate COVID relief bill, $10 billion worth, that does not include global COVID relief at all. We also are going to be dealing with the top Biden strategist launching a new advertising firm. President Biden emphasizing the need to collect evidence to try Putin as a war criminal. And Virginia Thomas, Justice Thomas's wife, and her involvement within the plot to overturn the 2020 election. Here to help me break it all down are a group of distinct scholars. I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of them tonight. We have Dr. Cameron Blackmore, who is a scholar and practitioner from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who's dedicated to invoking change within the policymaking area. She completed her Doctor of Philosophy and Political Science from the University of Alabama. Prior to her doctoral studies, she obtained her Master's of Public Administration from Southern University in Baton Rouge. Community involvement through multiple service projects motivated her to advocate for social justice. She is currently a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow, where she is placed in a particular member of Congress's office on Capitol Hill. And so it goes without saying that I'm happy to have Dr. Blackmore's input tonight as we're dealing with these topics. So Dr. Blackmore, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we also have a good friend of mine who's back, Chris Johnson. Always a pleasure to have him on the program. Chris, of course, is a proud native Philadelphian. He's an alumnus of Oakland University. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in pre-law with a concentration in political science. He currently serves as a legislative staffer for Senator Bob Casey. He worked on the Democratic National Convention Committee in 2016. And he also worked for Pennsylvania State Representative Joanna McClinton before becoming a part of Senator Casey's staff. So, Chris, thanks for being back on. We also have Shelby Birch, who is a champion for social justice advocacy. Grounded in a Black feminist practice, her service and research intersect between education, gender, and racial equity and social policy. She is an alumna of City Year, the Urban Leaders Fellowship, and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Limpopo, South Africa. Shelby successfully built school capacity and improved learning outcomes for students by teaching, mentoring, and brokering community partnerships to increase literary resources. She is currently a John R. Lewis Social Justice Fellow for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where she engages in policy research on issues to advance racial equity for the Black community. Shelby, thanks for being on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We also have another friend of mine, Oliver Toulousma, who is a spoken word poet and a public speaker, who will serve as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Community Justice Project. In this role, of course, he'll be responsible for trying to prevent COVID-fueled evictions of small businesses and residential renters at high risk of displacement in South Florida. He earned his BA in political science at the University of Florida in 2018. He also obtained his Juris Doctorate from Florida A&M University College of Law in Orlando. Oliver, thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me. I've been working there for like 7 months now, so I got to update that.
And of course, we had another guest, but he may come on later, Arsene Charles. Hopefully he joins us. But ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to dive into some topics today. There's been a lot of talk about how Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has been treated during this confirmation process. A lot of folks on the right wing have tried to use different tactics, and none of them seem to really stick. They tried to use, child pornography as a way to try to portray her as someone who's soft on the most heinous of crimes. That didn't really seem to take off the ground as they planned. And so then you had Senator Marsha Blackburn say, well, can you define what a woman is? And so you have a lot of these, Fox News viewers on Facebook trying to troll the libs like they like to do and say, well, she can't define a woman. And that really is not, to me, that it hasn't really taken off the ground either. But I want to get your thoughts on the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court today? Anyone can jump in.
I would like to kick us off, and I just want to start by saying that this is a celebratory moment for our community, for the Black community, especially for Black women and femmes around the world. Today, I choose not to, I guess, dwell on the violence that she has had to endure by our institutions that she is going to serve for the rest of her life, for the rest of our lives, right? And it's crazy to think that it took all of that just for her to get here. So, I just want to give her praise and her flowers. Job well done. And this is a win for us, for sure.
Yes, I've had a busy day today. I am home in my hometown, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So I've had lunch with my cousins, had conversations with my aunts. So I am just like full just to take time out of my day just to acknowledge the accomplishments of this Black woman. She is one of the most qualified justices that have been placed on the Supreme Court probably in its history. So for me, it's beyond her being a Black woman. It's just her and what she brings to the profession, what she's going to bring to the high court. And I think that we need someone like her on the court, not just because she's a Black woman, but because she's someone that understands the law. She understands justice. She's ready to use her expertise and her skills to make decisions that are going to impact our society for decades to come. So I am excited just to be alive in this moment and just witness it and be able to, tell future generations about this moment and what it means.
And it's amazing how she was able to get the support of Senator Susan Collins, of course, who prides herself in being someone who is a moderate, someone who can serve like a maverick, in the kind of in the mold of John McCain. Mitt Romney, of course, that was another, I guess, pleasant surprise for those who are, rooting for Judge Jackson's confirmation. Chris, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I echo the chorus from Shelby and Dr. Blackmore. Just want to say this is a very momentous occasion. I was really proud when we actually saw the official vote tally, and it just reminded me of the promise that America has espoused, which is this is a place where folks can come and live out their dreams and make a difference. And there are oftentimes, quite often where, that dream is not realized or we fall short. And it's frustrating, right? Even watching her, go through that confirmation process, which was grueling. And, you can use so many terms to kind of define how that process was. But to see her be able to stand in the face of that fire and do it with so much grace was promising. I'm also just proud for her and the work that she has done over the years to go through this process and gain all the qualifications needed to be one of the most qualified justices that we've ever had, like across the board, not just as a person of color, but as a nominee, right? I think that's something to be said for. And I think also Dr. Blackmore also mentioned that, it's not just her being a Black woman, but also for her being the first federal public defender. This is a unique perspective that she'll be bringing to the court. And I'm excited to see her as a jurist, as a Supreme Court justice, and just grateful that she made it onto the court. Another thing that I want to add is it's just interesting to see how these confirmation hearings, how they transpire. And here's the game. It's a cynical game, but the game is using these high profile public hearings, not to just disparage the nominee or a candidate, but really to define the opposition as it relates to this particular nominee. So it's about using Judge Jackson as a way to define Democrats. That's the Republican strategy, right? So the questions that they were asking her, some of the case issues, which were false narratives that they were pushing, but it was not about her. It's about using these opportunities to define the Democratic Party in the face of, as we prepare for the midterm elections. And that's part of the game. It's a cynical game. It's frustrating to see, but that's what happened. But ultimately, we're glad that she's on the court and it's going to make a difference for generations.
Yeah, and these processes are becoming more of they're becoming more like endurance obstacle courses rather than like educational experiences for the public, to get to know this judge's judicial philosophy. A lot of grandstanding took place. A lot of gripe took place about previous hearings, and Dick Durbin, I think, should be praised because of his intervention, serving as a referee and saying, she doesn't have anything to do with how you feel about how Brett Kavanaugh was treated or how Amy Coney Barrett was treated. We're looking at this specific judge. Ask her about the cases that she was dealing with as a circuit court judge. Stop looking for outside material to bring into this hearing. And I thought that was important. Oftentimes we're often quick to criticize the heads of committees whenever they allow things like that to go on without any kind of pushback. But I think Durbin did a commendable job during these hearings. And what's also noteworthy is the timing. 6 weeks, but within the period of 6 weeks, we had a announcement, and now we have a new justice. And I think that's great, especially when Mitch McConnell, his crown jewel of being in the majority, is making sure that he gets these swift nomination processes under his belt. And of course, we see the result, a 6-3 conservative tilt. But at the same time, I think that the Democrats seem to learn from his playbook a little bit. Oliver?
I mean, obviously, I think she stands as an iconic judicial figure already. And she hasn't even ruled on a case on the Supreme Court. And I think she's serving as a role model for so many individuals, both inside and outside of the law, not only on the being able to achieve at the highest levels, but to be able to persevere in the face of such vitriol and spitefulness. I think it's going to be very interesting. Not just the fact that she's on the Supreme Court, but her career trajectory, sending a signal to folk, particularly those who are elected officials, to be vocal about putting more public defenders on the bench. I think too many times on the federal level, but also on the state level, there's almost an assumption, foregone conclusion, that if you're a judge, that you're going to have to be a prosecutor. And I think that's something I think you and Mike and I probably have a little more intimate experience with our classmates, that most people probably want to, be a prosecutor, be a state attorney before being a state judge, or, being an AUSA before sliding over into the federal judiciary. And it doesn't have to be that way. That you can espouse the ideas of equity and fairness without having to be lean into this who can be tougher on crime, which is precisely what Chris was talking about when he said they're trying to attack her record on not being tough enough on crime. That's really just straight out of these traditional notions of what it means to be a judge. So I hope that she has the opportunity, because I think she's trying to fill, or in the minds of so many, she's trying to, live up to expectations that so many people have of her. I hope that she has the space and takes the space to formulate her own judicial philosophy. I think that just wasn't something that was very vocal. Like, what does she truly believe in? I think so many people on the left were focused on defending her from these almost baseless attacks on the right, because everybody kind of knew that she was qualified. Then nobody really took the time to really lay out, she's ruled on over 1,000 cases. She clearly has a philosophy on something. Let's get to the root of what she truly believes in. So hopefully she has the room and is given voice on the court to make those philosophies more clear. So folk can either rally around her or hold her accountable. Irrespective of what side of the political spectrum that you're on, that she should have the opportunity to be treated like an intellectual, just like everybody else is able to be treated like an intellectual. Obviously, I think that's something that Black women just don't get the latitude to do in professional life, but she's just experiencing that on a much, much bigger stage.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up those points. And I couldn't help but compare this nomination process with the most recent one, the one with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And to me, this one was more intense because Amy Coney Barrett, to me, got away with not having to really reveal much about her judicial philosophy. In fact, it kind of made me feel like I was doing a Con Law 101 crash course before like an exam, because all she did was recite the rulings of hearing, like of cases like Brandenburg versus Ohio for First Amendment, or Isaacstad for or contraception cases, because a lot of the Democratic senators were trying to pull out of her, where's her stance on a woman's right to choose what happens to her own body in light of what could potentially happen for Roe versus Wade this summer. And she really got away with not having to reveal much of her cards. And here we had a situation where senators were asking, define what a woman was. Trick question, because if you use a specific definition, then we can kind of get a glimpse of how your judicial interpretation would be, and then you get to reveal more than those who went before you had to reveal. And I thought that was noteworthy, because oftentimes we can just move on from these kinds of things as if both hearings were equal in terms of the measure and weight of questioning. But to me, I just didn't see that. But as we're on the topic of the Supreme Court, Virginia Thomas, of course, a conservative activist who's married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, repeatedly pressed White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. This was reported last week, of course, in a series of urgent texts exchanges in the critical weeks after the vote. The messages, 29 in all, reveal an extraordinary pipeline between Virginia Thomas, who goes by Ginny, and President Donald Trump, top aide, during the period when Trump and his allies were vowing to go to the Supreme Court in an effort to negotiate the election results. This was a huge bombshell news to me, probably one of the biggest headlines of the year, because, of course, we know that the judiciary branch is supposed to be untainted by any kind of political influence. Here we have the spouse of a Supreme Court justice, heavily involved in political efforts to overturn what was, according to the individual who was tasked with the election security, the cleanest and most safe election in U.S. history. And so, panelists, I just want to ask you guys, on the topic, does Justice Thomas's refusal to comment on his wife's involvement with efforts to overturn the 2020 election cast any doubt, in your view, on whether he was aware and involved himself?
For me, most definitely. I mean, we know I'm not married, but husband and wives, they pillow talk. And when you're a Supreme Court justice, I feel as though you should be held to a higher standard, and who knows where that case with, President Trump, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that he, some kind of way, his case ended up in the Supreme Court. That's a huge conflict of interest right there, where your spouse is literally, communicating with his chief of staff. So I personally take that very seriously. And especially, we're just coming off these confirmation hearings, and, we're seeing a candidate that was being drilled about judicial policy making and all of these abstract theories, so to speak. But you have a justice and his spouse that are involved with the president's chief of staff, and a president such as Trump is that. So I think it's serious, and I definitely, I don't know if he should step down from his position, but I definitely think it should be investigated, more seriously. We should take it with a grain. We shouldn't take it with a grain of salt.
Just to add on to that, I think the thing that alarmed me about reading this story is just how viral and infectious Trumpism, political misinformation around the 2020 election has been, right? You'd imagine that there are some folks who have been following the former president from the very beginning who would believe anything he would say or espouse. But then to go on to see leaders at the state level, and then leaders at the congressional level, even at the Senate level, and by virtue of her spouse at the Supreme Court level, ascribed by these sorts of falsehoods, about baseless claims about the election. It's just really frightening, because we're supposed to believe that we have strong systems in place, strong institutions in place, that are meant to keep our democracy afloat. And we're starting to see, actually, we're not starting to, we've been seeing this for many years, especially in the era of Trump, just how fickle and how fragile our systems are. And so we really have to be very cognizant of this and understand that what the implications are. Sometimes we think the implications are my party winning versus another party winning. But if we keep stripping down and fighting down and kind of stripping down the institutions of our democracy, these sort of things that hold us up, it'll eventually crumble if we don't take this stuff seriously. And so that's kind of where my mind has taken me as I've been following this story, and it's something that we have to continue to monitor going forward.
Yeah, I just can't help but imagine, what if it was the shoe was on the other foot. Sotomayor had a significant other that that was heavily involved with trying to get, some kind of overturn the election in favor of the Democrats, right? If Trump had won re-election, could you imagine the outcry on Fox News every night? Would they just settle for, take my word for it, we didn't talk about this? I mean, it's just amazing to me the level of lopsidedness, especially when it comes down to these kinds of things that occurs, and oftentimes it's the right that's always crying foul about how things aren't fair for them, about how the media is, tilted towards the Democrats' favor. It's just mind-boggling to me. Shelby, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to echo my colleagues and say that, I think it's a good strategic move on Justice Thomas and to maybe not comment, because it could possibly implicate himself and really compromise his position. So, I know he's going to stand beside his wife or possibly, but I think that right now, I would keep silent too, especially seeing how we have members of Trump's party, cabinet are being held in contempt right now. He does not want to continue to jeopardize himself or just everything that's happening right now in the media. So, I think it's a good strategy on his end, because it's pretty messy. It's a little messy, if you ask me.
So that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, do you think that it's likely that public pressure would force Justice Thomas to recuse himself on January 6 cases? And if he doesn't, how is the image of the Supreme Court, in your view, impacted?
I mean, I find it hard to believe that public pressure will mount, will mount up to the point in which Justice Thomas himself will recuse himself. I'd imagine perhaps the Chief Justice, if he really values the court, the integrity of the court, may ask him to recuse. I mean, these are just like things that I've been thinking about, but I don't, because we have such a microphone on both sides and everything has been polarized, and one side will be, entrenched on one view and another side will be entrenched on another view. It's hard for us to determine whether public pressure can actually, will public pressure work and hold people accountable. We just haven't seen that in recent times because of the lack of shame, the lack of guilt that's been shown by our political leaders in the last few years or so. So I'd imagine it'd be hard for public pressure to force Justice Thomas to recuse himself. But, if there's still something left, some integrity left in the Supreme Court side, then perhaps the Chief Justice may have to step in at some point.
I'm gonna say no for public pressure. I mean, look at the January 6th events themselves. I mean, we have a situation where citizens literally tried to overthrow the government, because that's what it was. And there have been little to no consequences for that thus far. I just read an article today where there are two cops and one is snitching on the other, because he's going to trial for his involvement with the insurrection. But I mean, what's the likelihood that he would actually see a tough sentence? So I feel as though if you have a situation where there are no consequences for the people that literally participated in the event, then I think Justice Thomas is gonna skate on by. And if any of the cases end up in a high court, he's not going to be required to recuse himself. He's not going to do it. And we're going to have a situation where, in my mind, the Supreme Court will be tainted, because, I mean, we would be up in arms if this happened at the local level, at the local federal level, at the state federal courts. I mean, not the state federal courts, but at the state court level. We have processes in this country, and I don't feel as though we all live by the same rules. I don't feel as though we all have the same consequences for our actions.
No, those are good points. And what's also interesting is that we had Jared Kushner behind closed doors, talk with the January 6th committee. And now this week we had Ivanka Trump behind closed doors as well. And I think she spent about 8 hours. And you don't really spend 8 hours pleading the fifth. So there was something said and some kinds of information that was revealed. And what's interesting is that they chose not to invoke executive privilege. These are two people who were in Trump's inner circle up until that period, when there was a transition between Trump's administration and Biden's. And so I'm curious to know, why do you think Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump chose not to assert executive privilege? And even Mark Meadows, you're talking about 2,320 text messages that he decided to turn over before he said, I'm not going to work with the January 6th committee anymore. Like, that to me seems to just undermine any kind of effort from you or from you to not kind of give any information that could potentially be damaging to Trump or anyone in his orbit, especially as they're constantly stoking the passions of their base, that they're going to make a rebound in 24. What do you guys think?
Well, I think it's. Oh, well, first, I don't know if it was Jared Kushner that was attempting to assert executive privilege or saying that he was going to waive it, or if it was the White House that came out and said that they're not going to exercise executive privilege. And I think it brings up a whole host of interesting legal questions, because I think just generally the limits in these parameters of executive privilege have not been very well defined by the Supreme Court. We've essentially been running on a 50-year precedent set by U.S. v. Nixon, and then kind of definitions from the White House legal counsel to kind of inform the justices. I think the statement put out by the White House today, essentially stating that you shouldn't be able to exercise executive privilege over an attack on the Constitution itself, would just, I think, lead itself to an average person asking the question, can you exercise executive privilege for something that you deem to be a crime? If you're making that conclusion that the reason why the attack on the Constitution is wrong is because it's a crime, I think it gives very interesting. There's a lot of questions that I think if this case were to reach the Supreme Court would be forced to answer. I know with the McGahn situation, the Supreme Court declined to provide really additional parameters, hard parameters on the question of executive privilege. So I think there's just a whole host of legal questions that exist, and one way or another, the court has to be ready to answer. I think tying it back to your last question about not just Clarence Thomas, but I think this case more specifically could do more to either rebuild or further destroy trust that the public may have in the Supreme Court. I think it's going to be very interesting if folk feel that what if this is a lot of ifs here. If there was a case that made it to the Supreme Court and the opinion was one that appeared to be politically charged, at least in part, it could just do further damage to, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum, eroding trust in the Supreme Court as a legitimate institution.
No, those are solid points, and I'm glad you brought them out, because what I thought of was that, I'm just seeing the conservative appointed justices saying, well, they didn't have to sit before the Senate to be confirmed for their executive positions. Kushner and Ivanka Trump were senior advisors to the president, so they didn't have to go through the Senate confirmation process. So therefore, maybe they don't fall within what we would consider, I guess, those who can invoke executive privilege. So yeah, there's so many ways around, the fact that these two individuals, chose to continue to, engage with the committee, and especially where, for the most part, even going back to the, the Mueller investigation, a lot of these people had to be subpoenaed, before any information was pried out of them. And so, I think it's very interesting that they chose to share information. I know that in the waning days, a lot of officials were using Ivanka Trump as to kind of be the voice of reason, because as Trump was getting closer and closer to January 2021, the group of people around him started to get thinner and thinner and thinner until, according to the book by Bob Woodward, there was just an eerie absence of any kind of, presence in the White House. And Ivanka Trump was used as the person to try to talk some sense into Trump giving this whole charade up, stop the steal effort. And so, it's going to be interesting, especially as we're going into the midterms. And, I'm curious as to know, whether or not the public is, just getting tired of this. We're tired of hearing, okay, we're going to get damaging information one of these days, but we're still not getting it. And we're getting closer and closer to November. And I think that was the thing that got, Republicans a little bit of a benefit when Mueller came out and basically said, I can't confirm or deny whether or not the president was involved in any kind of Russian involvement in the 2016 election. Anyway, I just want to pivot to it as time is moving on. The fact that, it was reported this week that top Biden strategists are going to be launching a new advertising firm. And, this firm is, of course, is going to be called Blue Sky Strategy, which is already working for the Biden affiliated group Building Back Together and Future Forward, a liberal nonprofit that spent nearly $150 million in the last election. Among its founders are Patrick Bunisnor, who served as the director of paid media for Biden's successful 2020 campaign, and John Fromowitz, the co-founder of Future Forward and an advisor to the Biden campaign. Fromowitz, of course, is credited with making the Democrats' minute-long ad that aired during the 2020 World Series. And, Bunisnor said, we sat across $1 billion in advertising spend that won and beat Donald Trump. But of course, there are other factors that I was thinking of as I, looked through that article. And I was like, you had the Lincoln Project, which was the first time Republicans actively engaged in trying to unseat the Republican incumbent president. You had a lot of people who were just so COVID weary. It was a culmination of a lot of different things. But I want to ask you guys if you think that, as it pertains to the consulting firm, what does the Blue Sky Strategy have to do to stand out, in your view, among the myriad of Democratic media consulting entities that are already out there?
I think there's just a broader critique that I think I have. I think just generally, I appreciate the sentiment that former First Lady Michelle Obama had when she said, when they go low, we go high. I also feel like it is a luxury afforded to some in the political space and not others. I think it's easy to be frank, I think it's easy for white folk to be cordial to white folk because I think black folk in this space aren't afforded that cordiality. And if the Democratic Party is serious about courting black voters, then it has to be very vocal and very clear in its defense of black folk and its advocacy in black issues. Moreover, and I think this is something we're going to talk about later, not being willing to capitulate in order to appease folk who probably will not vote for you anyway. I think Stacey Abrams made it very clear that you might have a much better time introducing new people into the electorate instead of just playing with the folk who are already in the sandbox. And introduce new people into the electorate. Expand voting rights. You know, just act, civil liberties more generally, and you might have a better time. So I think this consulting firm has to be serious. I think I'm just speaking for Black people because everybody on this call is Black. There has to be a full-throated defense and support of Black folk, because I think the niceties and cordiality, I think when Black folk express frustration or anger in these spaces, when they're showing up with nothing else but themselves and their lived experiences, this is not a game for a lot of folk. And I think treating it as just another consulting job or another campaign that some folk may not have the luxury to live through 4 years of an administration that cuts Social Security or cuts Medicaid and Medicare or a lot of what's left of our social safety net. So they have to be very, very serious. And it's not just limited to Black folk. I think all marginalized identities, they just have to be serious. You can't ride out on being polite.
No, that's a good point. And, we're kind of entering this period where a lot of people are kind of drifting away from traditional cable news, and we're going towards streaming services. You've got CNN Plus now. Even CBS has a streaming service. And so I guess, the fact that more Americans seem to be drifting towards or cutting the cord with cable news and broadcast TV, and they're embracing these streaming outlets. Political advertising seems to have skyrocketed because $3 billion was spent in ads, $3 billion in 2020. And that was according to Allpack, which with the vast majority of that going towards linear television. And so in your view, it seems like the top aides that are creating this firm seem to be pulling the lesson from 2020 is the more you spend, the more successful you're going to be. Look at our World Series ad. And I'm wondering if that's the right conclusion to draw from that, especially when a lot of the messaging from the other side, the right, will be on the Afghanistan withdrawal, on the price of gas and inflation. And so, in your view, what do you think this firm, or how can this firm really help Democrats when the messages that are already being baked now, that the Democrats have allowed, inflation to just go out of control, and that they really can't, handle themselves on the world stage, as evident by the chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal?
I honestly think that one thing needs to happen, or a few things actually need to happen. I think they need to get very clear on their messaging, and I think they need to build a united front, because I think that the Democratic Party I think they do great work, and I don't think that they don't put enough energy into talking about what they do in a way that is compelling, that is persuasive. And I feel like they got to play the hardball with their opponents. And for me, as I was reading the article, even though that we've transitioned to streaming platforms, Americans are still watching TV, at least spending 2 hours a day on TV. So it's making sure that they collect the right insights and data to understand what are the trends that constituents are doing, right? They need to get clear about what's going on, how can we best reach, not exclude any possibility. I think they need to tackle it from all fronts. But one thing is so very clear: there are a lot of jaded folks right now who are tired of the Democratic Party. They feel like nothing is happening, nothing is getting done. And it frustrates me because, as someone who has worked on the Hill previously, I see that there's a lot of good work that is happening, but there is a communication gap. There is a knowledge gap. So I think that these media consulting firms should really get clear and just tighten up the messaging and get the party a little bit more unified. Because I mean, I'll stop right there. But you get my sentiment.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me that when Biden was going out on the stump to praise the American Rescue Plan and in the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure bill that became law. What was amazing to me was that he was still saying, not a single Republican came on board with the American Rescue Plan, but we're still going to allow them to go and take credit and go back to their jurisdictions and constituents and make it seem as if. And I was like, there's bipartisanship, but then there's just too much in terms of yielding to the other side. And I'm like, I was even reading in the Woodward book, he even told aides privately, take care of Murkowski in Alaska. I know she couldn't vote for this for political reasons, but make sure she gets a significant portion. And you get Alaska got about $2 billion, in aid. And so while it's important to build these bridges, it's also important to let the folks know who actually was on board with giving them COVID relief and who was actually in board with rebuilding their bridges and roads. Chris?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And messaging is really, really important. And I can echo some of the things that Shelby was mentioning around, I know an elected official who uses the term, you've got to brag and blame, right? You've got to brag about some of the good work that you've done. You've got to blame the obstacles that have fought against you being able to get the additional work done. So you've got to brag about passage of the American Rescue Plan, which got 0 votes from Republicans in the Senate to actually get it done. You've got to brag about the ability to pass the infrastructure bill, which is going to do tremendous investments in rebuilding our roads, bridges, and highways, and making sure that folks can get access to broadband. We can get access to clean water and strengthening our waterways and making sure that our climate, we're more climate resilient going forward. You've got to brag about the fact that even in the House, they've been passing legislation to lower costs of prescription drugs, or fighting to make sure that Medicare and Medicaid can negotiate for drug prices. Like, you've got to talk about that, and then also talk about the fact that there are obstacles in the way of actually getting more passed. We often think that there are just 50 senators in the United States Senate. No, there are 100, right? There are 2 full parties that are supposed to be working together to pass legislation that is going to move the country forward. But oftentimes it seems like the burden of responsibility for governing properly and governing responsibly for people is just levied against Democrats. And that's difficult. That's going to be hard, but it requires hard work. And so I'm thinking, if I worked that blue sky strategy, I would do this. I would bring people to a table. I would bring folks to a negotiating table, have a voter on one side, have the party on the other, and say, who would you want to negotiate with? At one table, you have the Democrats in front of you. You would say, would you rather negotiate with Democrats who are going to fight to lower prescription drug costs, who are going to focus on strengthening the Affordable Care Act, who are going to focus on making sure our schools can remain safe and open, who are also going to make sure that they can try to lower cost of childcare, or even fight to make sure that community colleges can be free, or public colleges can be free as well? Do you want to negotiate with folks who are focused on that, or do you want to negotiate with another party who has no interest in passing legislation that's going to give more people health care? Actually, they're going to try to fight against it. Would you rather negotiate with another party? Negotiating meaning putting them in power, who don't even believe in science or don't believe that climate change is real. Like, we have to kind of paint the picture for people, because we often think that some of the gains that we haven't gotten throughout these last 2 years under the Biden administration and through this Democratic leadership is because of just Democrats having no will to make change. It's also, it's something that we need Republicans to be supportive. We need more Democrats in charge if we're going to give them the gavel to stay in power. But we've got to make that point clear, and also let people know who's done the good work and who isn't, who are the obstacles. I think that's what the Blue Sky Strategy and other consultants who are running digital ads throughout this election season have to do.
Yeah, and that's so important because there's been a lot of talk about how the Democrats have lost their way with the working class and with the blue collar folks. And I'm like, that's why I'm so excited. In all honesty, the most exciting Senate race to me is the one in Ohio. I know we're still in the primary season, but Tim Ryan to me is one of the most effective messengers for the Democratic side as it pertains to the working class. And I'm like, if this guy could take over Rob Portman's seat, I mean, imagine the damage he's going to do in the Senate. If you've seen him on C-SPAN in his hearings on the House, I mean, this guy is a dangerous guy, honestly. And so I'm thinking about being able to be that aggressive on the messaging is key and is important. We're often allowing the other side to craft this message for us, and then we're playing defense. No, we're not weak on crime. No, we're not weak on the world stage. No, challenge them back, like Chris said. Put them on the hot seat. Make them account for why it is that they didn't vote for the American Rescue Plan. What was the legitimate reason that they didn't give you any kind of COVID assistance and actually fought? And Susan Collins' idea was compromise was moving from like 615 billion to 650, and they were upset when they were like, no, we're going to hold our guns to 1.9 trillion. I mean, so you have to make that argument. And so, as we're moving along, time is running away from
Mike,
us.
it sounds like y'all were saying they need to show the receipts.
Exactly. Show the receipts. Show the receipts. I like that. And, as we're on the topic of COVID relief, the Senate, of course, announced Monday that they struck a deal on a $10 billion COVID aid package. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Mitt Romney of Utah announced the deal Monday afternoon, with Schumer lamenting that it was supposed to be $5 billion in global vaccine aid. He called it a goose egg because this bill does not include global pandemic aid sought by Democrats and a handful of Republicans. Senator Romney said he was willing to explore a fiscally responsible solution to support global efforts in the weeks ahead and in the coming days. The deal, of course, is a culmination of nearly a month of congressional hand-wringing over sending the Biden administration funds to keep fighting the pandemic. House Democrats scrapped a $15.6 billion deal last month after complaints from members about using the money that Congress had previously allocated to their home states. And so, folks, I want to ask you guys, as it pertains to this bill, do you think it's still likely that we can get some kind of global aid, global relief efforts in this package as negotiations are coming down to the wire?
I mean, let's just be honest about where we are as a country right now. Education system that is hanging by a thread. We have teachers and administrators literally walking out at the end of the school year. We have a healthcare system that is struggling. We did not get Build Back Better. So infrastructure is still, a big question mark as to what our roads, highways, and byways are going to look like in this country. And I mean, I am not a Republican. I am not all that conservative, but as far as global aid goes, like, really, where are we as a country? We need to make sure that we are fiscally using these funds to take care of the citizens that we are responsible for, like literally our children. I hate when I scroll on Facebook and I see all of these stories, and Twitter, all of these stories about educators leaving, because they're strained, they're not getting paid enough, but we are continually placing more responsibilities on them. And the pandemic didn't make it any better. Children don't have access to proper mental health care. And I'm just of the opinion that I personally see nothing wrong with our congressional members, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, saying, hey, look, let's think about this global aid. Where are we in terms of the COVID, in terms of the pandemic? Because in a lot of ways, we are still in the pandemic. As much as I think the whole country wants to be done with the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, and we're still dealing with this on our own home front. So where are we when we have Head Start educators literally calling our offices saying, hey, we need to have more money to pay our employees because they don't have enough. They don't even have enough to cover their own housing and their own health care and their own daycare for their kids to attend a daycare so they can tend to other people's kids. So I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but I personally, see nothing wrong with lawmakers going back to the table to say, hey, let's think through this, to make sure that we're using our limited funds in the best manner.
My only hope is that I would hope that the folks who are hesitant to pass this funding, or if their reason is they want to preserve it or protect it for schools and provide funding for schools and local governments and businesses, I would hope that's true. But I'm not quite sure if that's actually the case, right? I think another part of it is we have to understand that COVID-19 and viruses know no borders. And so there are countries, territories, islands across the globe that still need a lot of support. And America, we're in a place where folks are now even almost able to get 4 shots before another country can get 1 or 2. And in order for us to really get out of this pandemic environment, and not when I say us, not just America, not just me living in the city of Philadelphia, but I'm talking about us as an entire collective of people, we've got to make sure that we can provide the therapeutics, the testing capacities, as well as the vaccination opportunities to as many people as we possibly can. And we've been leading the globe in, having, doing the research, actually purchasing the vaccines, purchasing the testing equipment and things like that. And we've got to do our best to actually make it possible for everyone else.
I'll make mine brief. I think for me, I think it's still going to pass. I think like from the Democratic side, although they get the short end of the stick. And I think that's what I want to focus on, right? We rally and we try to input all of these really great humanitarian efforts, right? But it keeps getting railroaded and we keep making these concessions and we keep getting sidelined in these negotiations, right? And I'm just wondering when will we push back? So yes, it's going to pass, but I charge the negotiators on the Democratic side to ask, like, when is enough enough? When are we going to hold strong and stand strong in what we want and what we think is essential, not just for the American community, but for the global community?
No, those are solid points. And of course, negotiations, of course, were stalled. And when we're looking at the negotiators, we're looking at Senator Coons, Schumer, Romney, Patty Murray, who I had the opportunity and privilege to work for 5 months, Richard Burr, Roy Blunt, and Lindsey Graham. And one of the questions I asked Senator Murray's chief of staff was, why is it that the Help Committee seems to be one of the most productive committees in the Senate? Of course, this was in 2018 when the Republicans held majority. And he said, Senator Murray says bluntly, I'm not interested in running for president. She's strictly there since 1992 for policy. She wants to make it easier for mothers who were like her to be able to bring up their kids. And so when I'm looking at these negotiations being in limbo now, I can't help but wonder if there are political impediments now involved, especially as we're getting closer to the midterm election season, But of course, that aside, on the world stage, I'm also wondering if that undermines the United States message against Russia, as we're, of course, dealing with trying to take a position in favor of Ukraine against Russian aggression. And so as we're drawing to a close, I just want to bring up this question, being that there was a, mass killing in Bucha and, reports of rapes and killings and murders going on, and the barbarism that seems to be taking place on the Russian side seems to be just getting worse. And that's with the backdrop of Putin not according to some sources, not getting a full, picture of what the situation is like on the ground, at the Kremlin. And in addition to the fact that, his world image seems to be forever tainted. Even if he gets just a piece of Ukraine, I mean, this guy's image is always going to be tied to, the bombings of hospitals with children and mothers. And so, will President Biden's efforts, in your view, to collect evidence to show that Putin is a war criminal? Remember, he got a lot of pushback a couple of weeks ago on saying that Putin's a war criminal. Would that jeopardize the early stages, in your view, of the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine?
I think, at least from an international law perspective, there's evidence to support, or at least, the body of law there to support some of President Biden's accusations. I think when you're talking about trying, it's always a matter of enforcement in the country. And I think just the fact that Russia is, one of the most prominent members of the United Nations just makes enforcement that much more difficult. What is really the solution? Um, I would also think that Putin has probably gamed this out in his mind a little bit and thinking about, and before, choosing to invade Ukraine, what are some of the things that the United States and the West will probably respond with? One is probably sanctions, which, um, some of the things that he already tried to mitigate by setting up, internal payment processing service. So when Visa and MasterCard cease their use, there's no problem as far as everyday Russians trying to use their credit cards. And, obviously, what's the other only forum which to hold other countries accountable, which is probably, human rights courts and, particularly the United Nations. So I'm pretty sure he's probably gamed that out in his mind. I don't know how. I think it'll be fodder for Putin to lean more back into being aggressive if he's trying to drive a wedge between Ukraine and the United States. Uh, Essentially, like, well, the United States needs to back off in order to have peaceful conversations with Ukraine, and I think that's something that President Biden doesn't want to do. I think he probably wants to escalate things a lot more, and I think it's going to come up to the calculation that President Zelensky makes in determining. Obviously, he made it no secret that he wanted Ukraine to join NATO and ally himself with the West. So I think Putin is trying to use whatever he has at his disposal to really drive that wedge, because geographically, the other countries that border Ukraine and into Eastern Europe are all NATO alliances, are members of NATO. So it really isolates himself geographically from sympathizers in the Middle East, and the only neutral territory geographically that he has left.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this whole saga seems to be one in which, we're seeing Putin escalate, and then he'll say, "What are you talking about? We're not escalating." And then all of a sudden there'll be a development that they captured the nuclear facility, or that they're, amping up, the bringing in the tanks into this area, or that they're taking action against civilians. And so, in my view, why doesn't the United States play the same game and say, what javelin, what javelin, missiles, all the things that we're providing in terms of military weapons and support. Why don't we keep that discreet, play the same game and say, what are you talking about, until Ukraine actually does some damage? But of course, Biden sent $100 million worth of Javelin missile systems to Ukraine, and that's in addition to now imposing sanctions on Putin's own daughters. There's a lot of criticism about how sanctions actually hurt the working class, and they don't really get to the oligarch class in Russia. Well, now he's trying to cut through that veil and say, well, we're really trying to make them hurt. So in your view, has the Biden administration exhibited enough strength so far in its support of Ukraine in opposition to Russia?
Are you asking me, or are you asking the panel? Yeah, I would think that Biden is trying to play a careful game. So I don't think it's necessarily about trying to look too powerful. I think ultimately he's trying to make sure that he stymies any, further movement into Ukraine. I don't think he wants any, major cities or to be lost, any more land to be lost. I think is not only now, but his experience working as vice president with Crimea, he probably took it, lessons from that experience. So it's not necessarily about looking strong. I think he's really trying to mitigate any further casualties. And I think he's trying to play a long term political game to make sure that I think Western alliances of Western countries um, have a strong geographical line in opposition to Russia. And I think it's also a tough game because you have, I think, China, who's expressed at least sympathies uh, for Russia's situation, because obviously they have their own situation with contested territory or land, a country in Taiwan, depending on what side you fall on. Whether some folk feel like it's territory, some people feel like it's its own independent country. So I think it's forcing. I don't think Biden's only looking at Russia by itself, but how does his actions potentially strengthen a Russo-China alliance? And yeah, so I think he's trying to be very careful in how he's approaching this.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate having a president that is not trigger happy and that is not, getting on broadcast networks or in press conferences, bragging about nuclear weapons or, ready to push the button. I think Biden made it very clear in his State of the Union address that he was going to do his best to curtail a war. But if it came to that, we would definitely be ready, to deploy the military, wherever is needed. So I definitely, for me, I definitely see the strength and I definitely see the caution, and I think it's a care to, because we're in a very sticky situation right now with this whole Russia Ukraine. And I definitely think that he is doing his due diligence to, keep our involvement to a minimum while also making it known that, hey, if we have to go there, we definitely will. So the strength to me is definitely there.
If there are no others, I'm going to go ahead and thank Dr. Cameron Blackmore, Shelby Birch, Chris Johnson, Albert Slusman for a fantastic discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed, just dialoguing with you guys on these important issues pertaining to public policy and domestic front and international relations. I really enjoyed episode 61. I hope those watching enjoyed. Tune in next week on Thursday at 7 p.m. as always. And I want to encourage my audience to stay away from sketchy news sources and remain plugged in and always question and challenge the source that you do get your news from. With that being said, thank you guys so much for what you brought to the table tonight. I'm grateful to each of you. I hope to have you all back when time allows. I know you're each very busy professionals. So thank you for making the time tonight. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 61 of the Political Mic. Good night.